So to keep our program moving, we'll now transition into our main panel discussion, which will tease out some of the ideas that were brought to light during our military mobility workshop. And then we'll wrap up the day with a special message and closing keynote from Admiral Rob Bauer, who is Chief of Defense of the Netherlands and was recently elected to become the next chairman of the NATO Military Committee. Results and our recommendations with our discussions here today and from the workshop. We'll also be producing a final report with the help of our 5 working group leaders and our 2 senior advisors, former NATO Assistant Secretary General Heinrich Brauss, and especially Professor Dr. Julian Lindley-French, who has the lead on the report. So I would just encourage you all to keep an eye out for that in early 2021. And then let me just emphasize that, of course, today's discussion is on the record, so please feel free to use anything you hear today. When we open it up for questions in the next session here, our team is tracking your comments and questions via the Zoom Q&A function, as well as on Twitter under the live stream tweet and on Facebook under our live stream there. So please do feel free to chime in. And with that, let me hand it over to perhaps military mobility's biggest champion, retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, to share a bit more about the workshop, introduce our next speakers, and share the great discussion to come. Ben, thank you so much, and over to you.
Lauren, thank you very much. And thanks to General Scott Kensvater, better known around the Air Force and NATO as K9. So successful deterrence and collective defense require the capability for rapid reinforcement, which in turn relies on military mobility to move equipment and personnel across rivers, bridges, and mountains, all while protecting critical infrastructure from cyber vulnerabilities. However, this movement is likely to occur across vast distances, multiple border crossings, and the infrastructure of several host nations, and most importantly, during peacetime conditions, before a crisis is officially declared. This means that political and military leaders could face the decision to mobilize under peacetime conditions, which would present significant restrictions on where, when, and how forces could move. How prepared are the United States and our allies and partners for a crisis scenario which requires speed of prevention or reaction or reinforcement? We just heard from General Kensvater, who clearly emphasized how important it is that land forces are able to move rapidly to prevent a potential crisis in Europe or to respond to a crisis, and that military mobility is in fact one of the tools of collective defense. The European Union also recognizes that military mobility is important and has established military mobility as one of its PESCO projects, with the Netherlands in the lead. Billions of euro have been budgeted by the European Union for improving military mobility. So why do we still have challenges to this essential capability, and what do we do about them? Over the past year, CEPA has hosted a workshop and a series of events to address those challenges and to develop recommendations for changes to strategic policy at NATO, the European Union, and the relevant nations. Today is a formal but interim outbrief of that effort. As Lauren said, our full written report will come out early in 2021. For our workshop, we developed 5 scenarios that would enable us to look at what is required to move a full range of vehicles and cargo across national boundaries and using all types of infrastructure. Those scenarios include the following: Nordic-Baltic, led by Colonel retired John Agoglia; Suwałki corridor, led by Dr. Jacek Bartosiak; Focșani Gate in Romania, led by Dr. Phillip Peterson; Western Balkans, led by Greg Melcher; and Libya, led by Brigadier General retired Hans Damen. Our scenarios were designed by Dr. Oliver Gnad and Miriam Ludwig from the Bureau for Zeitgeschehen, which is about strategic foresight, based in Frankfurt, Germany. For each scenario, we had a virtual cross-functional working group, with each working group consisting of about 30 experts from NATO, multiple agencies within the European Union, the relevant nations, several different think tanks in the United States and Europe, industry, and international media. Industry experts included rail, wheeled and tracked vehicles, air and missile defense, bridging, and cyber. Today we'll start with a discussion with our 2 senior advisors, Dr. Julian Lindley-French and General Heinrich Brauss. They'll address the key takeaways from the workshop and the strategic policies that must be revised or added. We'll then bring in each of our working group leaders throughout the discussion to address specific operational, tactical, and technical topics that were relevant to their specific scenario. We'll have plenty of time for questions from our listeners, and I'll be bringing those questions in throughout our discussion. So first, let me turn to Dr. Lindley-French. Julian, you recently wrote that NATO's new concept for the deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, the so-called DDA, is designed as a stepping stone en route to an adapted, transformed alliance. It is also designed to deliver an unambiguous, consistent, and continuous demonstration of alliance military power with a commitment to operational purposefulness by emphasizing not just awareness of, but also future effectiveness across multiple warfare domains and in multiple geographic areas. Where does military mobility fit within the DDA? Is it an essential component of the DDA? Julian.
Thank you, Ben, and good afternoon, everybody. Look, listening to K9 and having dealt with him in the last few weeks, it's very clear that the alliance gets it. The alliance gets the momentum of change that's going on. I'm not sure our political leaders do yet. This is going to be, in many ways, a kind of a mind-bending moment when the ends, ways, and means of alliance have to be completely readdressed because of COVID-19 and the coming economic crisis. And what major crises do is they accelerate strategic change, profound change. And if we continue on the current trajectory of effort, then it's going to be a simple point of COVID-19 or defense. That's the choice, because fundamental rethinking needs to take place. Therefore, given the pressures on US forces worldwide, given the nature of COVID-19 and its economic crisis, this is a tipping point in both geopolitics and European defense. And it's especially so that given that the likes of China seem to have fared far better economically in this pandemic than many Western, particularly European powers. Therefore, the only way to close what I see as a growing gap between available funding and needed capability and capacity is to fundamentally reconceive what we mean by combat support services across the crisis management and defense and deterrence spectrum. Structural combat support services, to my mind, must thus include the ability to move force and resource quickly across Europe in an emergency, with much tighter and faster cooperation between sending nations and host nations across the four cross-cutting challenges that this project was designed to test. Now, this is not just an issue of reinforcing the concept for the defense and deterrence of the Euro-Atlantic area. This is about messaging, it's about credibility, it's about demonstrating that we've understood the nature and scale of the challenge that we face, and we're prepared to take some fairly radical steps towards easing them. So fostering enhanced military mobility for me is thus not only a way to help ease the looming and dangerous post-COVID-19 credibility, capability, capacity crunch from which both NATO and the EU are likely to suffer, but also act as a vital vehicle for what will be the leitmotif, the signature of this decade, which is synergy building. As such, mobility should be seen as part of a trinity of specialization, interoperability, and mobility, not just, as I've said, as a means to an end, but also as a fundamental change of culture if we are to close the ends, ways, and means gap that the NATO and indeed the EU or Europeans are going to face. Ben?
Julian, thanks. Let me turn to your partner, Heinrich Brauss, who was our other senior advisor throughout this process. And by the way, I am going to come back to you in a moment and ask you about the written report and what we expect to accomplish with our written report. But to Heinrich, from a specific NATO defense policy point of view, and of course, a few people on the planet know more about NATO's defense planning than you, what role does military mobility play in the alliance posture? And also, of course, you having come from Germany, you'll have a view towards the European Union. What role does military mobility play there?
Thank you, Ben, and a very good morning to America and a good afternoon to Europe. In particular, greetings to those attendants who are my former colleagues. As Scott Finsfather and you yourself have already outlined, military mobility means that military forces can be rapidly moved across the Atlantic and across Europe to where they are needed in peacetime, crisis, and conflict. It's clear Russia's aggression against Ukraine, Moscow's policy of constant confrontation, its hybrid warfare, even in peacetime, and its continuous military buildup have led NATO to strengthen its deterrence and defense posture as outlined by Scott. The Baltic region is of particular concern. The Baltic states and Poland share common borders with Russia. Moscow has large, superior, high readiness forces there that could threaten these allies within a few days. NATO's multinational battle groups signal that in case of an attack, Russia would immediately be at war with NATO as a whole, but the credibility of this posture demands that these allies could be rapidly reinforced by United States and European forces. That being said, there are several regions and a number of allies located along NATO's eastern border that would be at risk in a crisis with Russia. From northern Norway through the Baltic Sea region to the Black Sea region. NATO must therefore be flexible and agile to ensure it has the right forces in the right place at the right time through rapid reinforcement. And finally, despite new emphasis that has been placed on deterrence and defense, NATO has committed to continuing to be able to crisis response beyond NATO's borders if needed. As a consequence, the ability rapidly to move allied forces in the crisis over long distances is therefore essential. Speed is of the essence, and speed is what matters. To your second question, Ben, why is it important for the EU as well? I think it's safe to say that the EU faces the same challenges and threats as NATO does. Not everybody in the European Union would agree, but it's true. Both are confronted with an aggressive Russia, but both are also facing increasing instability. Multiple crises, wars, terrorism, and migration in and from the south. Both must therefore be able to engage in crisis management in the south. The European Union focus on civil military crisis management with a clear emphasis placed on a range of political, economic, capacity building, and humanitarian activities. But effective crisis management often also requires military means. Moreover, the European Union has set itself the ambition to become a geopolitical union and to advance towards a European defense union. So for the European Union's ability to act, it is important to be able to swiftly move forces across Europe to deploy them to crisis regions beyond NATO's borders as well. As a result, there is a clear joint interest of both NATO and the European Union in improving military mobility and a huge opportunity for NATO and the European Union for further enhancing their cooperation in this field. Thus, military mobility has become a flagship project for NATO-EU cooperation, which is also important for transatlantic burden sharing, as the United States also benefits from it for the deployment of its forces across and from Europe. Over. Back to you, Ben.
Heinrich, thank you very much. So, Julian, let me come back to you. Of course, the Netherlands has the lead within the EU's PESCO construct. And this past week, the Netherlands launched Defense Vision 2025. Implicit to the vision is the need for allies to specialize across a range of functions from digitization to logistics to military mobility. The Dutch admit that there is a large gap between their defense aspirations and available funding. Can enhancing and improving military mobility help foster the specialization, interoperability, and even integration that would be needed to close such a gap? And what is, in effect, NATO's future defense, deterrence, and posture, and defense and deterrence posture? Julian, over to you.
Thanks, Ben. Just be clear, it's Defense Vision 2035 that they've just launched, and in a sense, this is the best and the worst of European defense thinking. Its subtitle is "Smart, Technologically Advanced Organizations, but we're not willing to pay for it." And I'm not having a go at the Dutch. This is repeated all over Europe at the moment, and frankly will get worse. And if you read the vision, two important realities immediately become apparent. First, that for most European allies, the idea of a full spectrum capability is gone. It's over, including for some of the bigger ones as well, like the Brits and the French. And second, the nations will focus on what they can do best as part of a collective and in the EU framework, possibly a progressively common effort, which is what the strategic compass the EU is working up is talking about. But such realities also emphasize the importance of architectures that maximize effective outputs via efficient investment as central to balancing ends, ways, and means, as I said. And this can only be done by structural collaboration. Deep collaboration is the way forward for European defense to remain credible. Military mobility will be one such architecture, along with digitization, resiliency, information warfare, logistics, and other elements, because those architectures cannot be produced by any single European state. And one has to consider what K9 said, General Kinsvater, about moving towards collective defense again. What does that mean in practice? Well, that means a capacity of all the allies to address the worst case. And the worst case is an overstretched America that's facing multiple scenarios worldwide, an opportunistic Russia on Europe's borders, a crisis across Middle East and North Africa that's been engineered, in which Europeans would have to respond effectively at the high end as a first responder force. Today, that's hard to envisage, but that has to be the future. Heinrich rightly said that speed is everything. So not just maintaining the credibility of deterrence, but we must maintain the credibility of defense. And that means an ability to warfight in the environments that we are likely to face for ourselves, face as Europeans and indeed as Euro-Atlantic allies. So military mobility is one of those pillars upon which the architecture, or the future architecture of European defense must rest. And that can only be achieved with much greater synergy, much greater commonality, and a much greater common effort. Even if it's in pursuit of collective defense, it's going to require a fundamental change of mindset and of approach than the one we've got used to for the last 30 years. Ben?
Julian, thank you. In fact, we've already gotten a question from retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. Mark was the commander of U.S. Army Europe back at the time where just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the United States was making decisions, what turned out to be wrong decisions based on, we thought that the threat had gone away. And so Mark was trying to provide deterrence and build partner cooperation capacity at a time of decreasing resources. So he was dealing with what everybody is dealing with now. But he asked the question, he says, Julian Lindley-French suggested there is a required synergy between interoperability and mobility. I'm assuming the scenarios came to the conclusion that there is also required synergy with political will, funding, training and exercise, and other factors. My question, this is from General Mark Hertling, are there any specific issues that are negatively affecting capability more than others? So you've touched on it a little bit, and we'll get into some of these throughout the rest of the discussion, but how about you, and then I'll ask Heinrich, what specific issue probably has the most negative effect on improving military mobility?
I would say, if I'm being blunt, and I will be, the strategic illiteracy of many European politicians. At the moment, for understandable reasons, they are focused very much on the domestic. But when it becomes apparent, as it will, that they cannot close the ends, ways, and means gaps by current national trajectories of defense, at some point they will realize the vital importance of synergy, efficiency, and effectiveness, of which military mobility is a fundamental part. It's coming, it's got to. If it doesn't, European defense could well fail. Ben?
Okay, Julian, what a huge shock that you gave a blunt response. So thanks for that. So based on Mark's question, you're basically saying this political will is the principal negative effect or a limitation on proving this.
That is correct.
What K9 has said is an essential capability. Heinrich, what would you say as it is the most significant limiting capability, limiting factor to improving military mobility?
I would agree to Julian, surprise, surprise, and say the most important requirement is leadership attention, leadership engagement, and leadership direction, both at political and military level as well as at senior level in NATO and the European Union. I mean, both face the same threat, NATO and the European Union, but the cultures are different. NATO is focusing on deterrence and defense in the first place, and the European Union is focusing on civil crisis response in the first instance. Both need to come together, in particular the defense ministers in charge of Germany, in my view, who holds the presidency currently, and the Netherlands, who are leading the PESCO project, should engage vigorously. And at senior staff level, the leaders of NATO's international staff and international military staff, as well as the European Commission and the European Defence Agency, should meet, take stock, and give guidance. So the structured dialogue between the two staffs, NATO and the EU, that has been suspended for months because of COVID, need to be resumed as soon as possible. And in my view, they should identify those areas that must be tackled urgently to vigorously give a push ahead and of implementation of military mobility. And in my view, the structural dialogue should evolve in a standing group for military mobility coordination between the two staffs, NATO and the EU. And they should be complemented by representatives from US EUCOM and USRR in Europe, and should proactively make proposals to their councils, both in NATO and the EU, and how to advance military mobility with vigor and resolve.
Heinrich, thank you very much. A couple of other questions are starting to come in. I just want to get them on the table, and I'll circle back to you and Julian a little bit later. One of them is, how do we tackle, this is from Josh Arnold Forster, how do we tackle the political illiteracy of our politicians? And I think both of you have touched on it a little bit, but we'll come back to that one. And then specifically, are you seeing tangible achievements in PESCO initiatives with mobility? Is the EU military staff up to the task of being able to develop a coherent strategy? I think we'll probably touch on that as we go along here as well, but we'll come back to those.
Ben, we lost you momentarily.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm the Chinese are trying to prevent us from solving military mobility, I think. Okay, so let me turn to a specific scenario. Scenario one, which is the Nordic-Baltic working group, where we had to move a generic convoy from Norway through Sweden across the Baltic Sea to Estonia. This was led by Colonel Retired John Agoglia. John, let me ask you, what were some of the specific threats in the Nordic-Baltic scenario, like disinformation or cyber, posed by Russian Federation forces that limited military mobility in this particular scenario?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Ben. Thank you for the question. The key piece is that there's obviously some very robust cyber and information warfare threats by the Russian Federation against Sweden and Finland in particular. Sweden and Finland are no longer neutral. They are non-aligned. And that's a key point, but there's an awful lot of the population that would prefer to still remain neutral. And that's a seam that in societal form that through information warfare techniques that Russia's trying to exploit. And the key here, as we've talked about, is political will to be able to make the adjustments and investments necessary to move forward and support military mobility and protect against these threats. But to do that, the political leaders need to engage with both the industrial leaders as well as with their population and make them aware of the threats that are posed to them from the cyber perspective by Russia and the information warfare that's being conducted right now, trying to sow division within their nation in terms of this neutrality versus non-alignment. Finland and Sweden, as members of the EU, have decided to support the self-defense clause within the EU. And again, that's something that Russia is not very happy about, and will do everything in its power to try to prevent that from them doing that and being able to support it. So again, it really does come down to, first and foremost, the information warfare that's being conducted against the political will of that nation, that we have to educate our political leaders about, educate the population about, and educate industry about, for the need to standardize, develop interoperability, and educate the population. And I would say this is, as General Kinsvater said, NATO 3.0. I think we need to look at civil defense 3.0. How do we, as an alliance, how do we set up the proper things for civil defense like we did in the Cold War? What civil defense look like in the post-Cold War with the current threats?
John, thanks. Let me follow up on this. Just last week, the Swedish Ministry of Defense released a press statement that they were re-establishing 2 army regiments that will train light infantry for regional defense, and specifically included the requirement to protect lines of communication and key infrastructure between Norway and Sweden. What were some of the key findings of your working group with regards to movement from Norway to Sweden and then from Sweden beyond?
One of the things we found out is that in order to move from Norway through Sweden, you're going to have to use all means available. You're going to have to use the road system, the rail system, the ports, and it's pretty significant. And it's going to take over a big chunk of the infrastructure in that country. And it's going to be a very challenging, because you're going to move across the whole breadth of that country. The mission for protecting that infrastructure and the transiting, not so much protecting the infrastructure as much as the transiting forces, protecting those transiting forces, falls to the Swedish army. So the fact that the Swedish government has said that they realize they need more forces to accomplish that mission, I think is significant in showing that the political will of the Swedish government is there, and understanding of the threat that is posed by the Russian Federation, as well as the need to work and develop this military mobility and interoperability. The number of areas that need to be protected, again, are very, very significant. And it's going to take some real continued work and coordination between the Swedish military, the Swedish government, and Swedish industry and the population to secure that infrastructure and put in place the mechanisms to facilitate military mobility across Sweden. So this, to me, is an excellent step that demonstrates there is some political will within the Swedish government.
John, thanks. You make a great point. It's always been an important barometer for me that Sweden, a non-aligned country, as you correctly described it, decided to put troops back on Gotland Island because they believed that the threat was so real. So that the sort of the Kremlin narrative that this is just some old American or Eastern European saber rattling as a justification for what we're doing, when you've got a non-aligned country that's taken steps because they absolutely believe in the threat and what they're seeing there. Let me turn to Julian Lindley-French now. Julian, and then Heinrich, how about commenting on what you just heard from John from the Nordic-Baltic scenario?
Yeah, it was a fascinating scenario to observe, and John led it typically very, very well indeed. To be frank, if when I was looking at it, I was asking myself a couple of questions. You know, would we actually be moving such a force from east to west through Norway and Sweden and through the Baltic Sea, where the Russians have significant assets in such an emergency? But as an exercise, rather than fight the scenario, as an exercise in the challenges of moving a force and all the diplomatic, legal, infrastructural, force security, command and control issues it raised, it was a powerful case study in what needs to be done transnationally to enhance military mobility. The command control structures, the cross-border movements of dangerous goods et al., the whole infrastructural improvements for tracked, for example, with the impact of tracked vehicles on civilian infrastructure, and the vital role of civilian partners. You know, one thing that struck me when John was leading this working group was how the military realm must reconceive of how it handles information, particularly classified information, to ensure that civilians have access. Now that does raise a whole other set of issues about adversary and enemy access. But without these civilian partners, road, rail, air, sea, even monitoring movement of local authorities, it strikes me as very unlikely we will achieve the outcomes that we seek to generate. It's going to require a holistic civil military approach to realize this. Ben?
Great point, as usual. Heinrich.
You alluded already to it, Ben, in your comment to the scenario. It highlights again the importance of NATO and EU cooperation. Why? Sweden is not a NATO member, but a EU member state. But Sweden faces the same threat as we do as NATO. So there is a new demand for close cooperation, also in operation and planning terms, between NATO, the NATO alliance, and a partner, and I would add Finland as well. I think we can rely on the fact that our military commands, our military headquarters, Shape, Brunssum, Multinational Corps Northeast, the Joint Support Enabling Command, and the relevant national commands have been doing their job in implementing the NATO military mobility planning, in particular in terms of logistics planning. And I hope, and should I say, I'm certain, that they have done full-fledged detailed service of all routes required for moving forces to where they might be needed, including through the Baltic Sea region, and using services and host nation support by Sweden. But the success of that planning depends on progress in areas that is not under their control exclusively. If there is a crisis, legally speaking, still the peacetime regulations apply in Europe. So there is an urgent need for close cooperation between the European Union and NATO, between Sweden and Finland and NATO, and a number of national and civilian and military actors to get on with improving military mobility and to standardize, to harmonize the necessary arrangements, forms, timelines, and data identified in advance, develop them, coordinate them, so that there is no delay when it comes to moving forces through that region.
Heinrich, thank you. Let me, I want to turn to our next scenario now with Hans Damen. This was scenario number 5, which was focused on getting a European-based force down to deal with a crisis in Libya. And this one was exciting because not only the scenario was such a challenge, but also the movement to get across the Mediterranean into North Africa. Understandably, there was some uneasiness by some participants about something that was such a sensitive scenario. Hans, you did a superb job of managing this. Tell me, what was so different about scenario 5? What were some of the unique challenges associated with this scenario?
Hi, Ben, and hi, everyone. And thanks for your nice words. I believe the Libya scenario is different as it doesn't deal with the standard defense, the standard crisis close to the NATO borders, but a bit further away, or the preparation for such a defense. The Libya scenario was about peacekeeping, a peacekeeping operation conducted by the European Union under the wings of the United Nations. And in this scenario, Libya has been pushed towards an all-out regional proxy war, basically on Europe's southern border. The only difference is the Mediterranean in between, and that's threatening European security interests. Besides a revival of Sophia operation in the Mediterranean and an OSCE mission, the European Union decided to deploy an EU battle group to Libya to keep the armed militias involved in the conflict apart. And if this was real, that would have been the first real deployment of an EU battle group. It would have been an out-of-area operation, and this poses extra problems for the deployment of the battle group. In our working group, we discussed the necessity to deploy as operational ready, or if you wish, battle ready as possible to Libya. Reception, staging, onward movement requires a relatively benign environment and we don't see that in Libya in this scenario, and to be honest, also not in real life as events are evolving there now. We discussed the possibility of doing RSOM in a neighboring country. Tunisia might be a good candidate, or as much as possible in Europe. Afterwards, the movement to Libya from Europe would be mainly by sea transport, but by the availability of harbors in Libya is in question. It might be necessary to deploy amphibious capacity. Question, we also discussed whether we would have to deploy via rail and road to South Europe and take ships for instance, Marseille or Naples, or that it would be smarter to take ships straight from ports in Northern Europe, for instance, Hamburg or Rotterdam. That might be faster than intermodal transport. The problems within Europe for military mobility in this scenario don't differ a lot from the other scenarios. To the south, the roads and railroads are available. We didn't see any problem with Switzerland or with Austria. The question is whether the railroads are available for military transports on short notice. And that's the same for rail flat cars. There don't seem to be enough of them in Europe. Whether the European Union allies have enough stocks for an operation like this one is also a question. And last but not least, and already mentioned in scenario one, our working group saw cyber attacks as the main threat to quick and undisturbed deployment.
Hans, thank you. You covered quite a few really interesting aspects of this. Now, there's a question from Andrew Budd that's come in, and let me read the question. It was to everybody, but I want to read that question and then go to a specific thing that I think you can answer that would address this. Andrew's question was, are the NATO and EU command and control structures robust enough and resilient enough to organize and execute the mobility requirements in coordination with national authorities? Did the working groups look at this aspect? Now, there's a sub-question to that I want to ask you that's a little bit more specific, but it's in the vein of Andrew's question. The Joint Sustainment Enabling Command in and the Standing Joint Logistics Support Group, which is co-located there in both work for NATO, but they also work for the European Union. How's this possible, and how are they making that work?
Excellent question. I'm pretty sure that the NATO C2 structure is robust. I think there is still some work to do at the European Union, but the interesting thing is that both organizations you mentioned, they might be of help. They could be of help in this instance. The JSEC and the Standing Joint Logistics Support Group have been developed sort of parallel. STLG from SHAPE, Joint Support Enabling Command, is a multinational effort led by Germany. The tasks for both organizations overlap for a large part. Basically, they both have to make sure that support, logistics support, and mobility in the rear area of whatever operation are guaranteed, whereby the tasks of the JSECs are a bit broader than the Standing Joint Logistics Support Group. It is, I believe, a good thing that both the JSEC and STLG will be co-located in Ulm, Germany. And it's my idea that they should work as integrated as possible. So not only co-location, but integration. Using them for EU missions should never be a problem. People seem to forget all the time that at the beginning of this century, NATO and EU and NATO agreed on making all the C2 arrangements available also for EU operations. That was the Berlin Plus and the Nice arrangements. And I believe that specifically the JSEC and the Standing Joint Logistics Support Group should be used to coordinate a deployment like this one.
Hans, thanks. Let me turn to Dr. Oliver Gnaad. Oliver Gnaad is the best expert I've ever met on strategic foresight And he and his team, Miriam, helped develop all these scenarios. Oliver, let's talk specifically about the scenario for Libya. After y'all worked on it and then you've heard the results of Hans' working group using it, how about describe, if you were to rebuild this scenario to help further tease out what we're trying to do, what would you change, or would you?
Thanks, Ben, for the question, and thanks, Hans, for leading us into the discussion. As Hans just mentioned, developing the Libya scenario was characterized by high uncertainty, the highest uncertainty probably we faced in the process. Looking at the other four scenarios, this is more the traditional threat perception we had. So we are kind of acquainted to the security threat which is being posed there. At least this is our key assumption. And scenario building is always about checking key assumptions. So it is not about driving into the future and looking to the rear mirror. It is about checking your key assumptions and whether they are still valid. We've seen during the last couple of months the very volatile development in Libya. So what you have to do is prepare for the plausible developments, which are very much widespread, which you see here. What surprised us most is that in the Libya scenario, the forces which should be deployed are very much threatened by any kind of cyber attacks possibilities. From the very setup of the mission, where personnel is being assigned to a mission, till the deployment overseas. So it's a highly hybrid environment, whereas the other probably are much more traditional. So we would focus much more on the cyber threat than probably in other scenarios. Ben?
Oliver, thanks a lot. You and Miriam did a terrific job, by the way, putting together all of these scenarios, and that really was the great vehicle, pun intended, for helping us address so many military mobility issues. Let me come back now to Julian and then Heinrich. Very briefly, both of you, please, to comment on what we heard from Hans and Oliver about the Libya scenario. What are some of the strategic policy pieces that we'd want to address? Briefly, Julian.
I think the main policy issue is for Europeans to properly grip the sheer scale of the complexity and the challenge in a place like Libya. I mean, I published a 2017 book called The New Geopolitics of Terror, in which I went into some detail of that, which is still, by the way, available and very reasonably priced. You know, in a sense, the Libya scenario for me was almost a metaphor for how Europeans have to grip the scale of the challenge around their borders. There's nothing like, as yet, the will, the capability, or the capacity to properly engage in a scenario like Libya, and the length of time, that the sheer scale of resource it would require to properly shape an environment such as that. And in a sense, that's Europe's test. And you know, I'm struck by this issue of whether NATO should lead an operation or whether EU should lead an operation. It strikes me that the test for that should be which flag, which identity is the most efficient in achieving the political outcome that we all seek. If an operation has an EU flag on it, because frankly the EU has a different identity to NATO and et cetera, then that to me should be the defining factor. We have to take away any implicit competition in such places between the two institutions. We also have to recognize that if we keep hearing the cliche that NATO is a 360-degree alliance, well, in practice, that means credible deterrence and defense on our eastern flank, but also the ability to engage in places like Libya simultaneously, I would add. Ben?
Julian, thanks. Heinrich, Libya.
Libya would be a crisis region, and we'll agree, and listeners will hopefully also agree, as opposed to a collective defense operation, which are non-discretionary, of non-discretionary nature. Crisis response operations are of discretionary nature. So can be decided, will be decided by nations. They will decide when, how, and with whom they deploy forces and whether at all, or whether they look for other means to manage a crisis. And yet, for me, the scenario has again shown how important advanced planning is, even for possible crisis response operations. Not a full-fledged advanced planning, which we know in terms of crisis contingency operations plans for defense or standing defense plans, but detailed surveys of possible multimodal transport routes to such a crisis region, rail, road in Europe, sea transport, etc. So setting up the databases of all technical transport infrastructure to draw upon when it comes to real crisis response planning is of great importance. And for me, the discussions of the scenario has shown how important it is that that the planners, NATO or EU planners, include the military, MCC and the Allied military movement control centers from the very beginning of planning, so that they can provide their assistance from the outset. And in terms to command control, and returning for a moment back to Andrew Butt's question, it would likely not be a Berlin Plus operation because of the political hindrance and political impediments in both NATO and the European Union, but a so-called EU autonomous operation. And in this regard, it is no secret that the European Union would face a huge challenge to plan and deploy and manage and conduct such an operation and to sustain it. So it would need to work on its C2 structures urgently. Back to you, Ben.
Hunter, thank you. Okay, let's move to the third scenario. This was the Western Balkans scenario. The idea was some sort of a NATO or EU force was moving into the region to head off a potential crisis. Again, we're not trying to solve Balkans political issues, but we use that as the reason for trying to move a convoy, a generic convoy with all types of cargo and vehicles from Western Europe into the Western Balkans. We depended on the indomitable Greg Melcher from the New Generation Warfare Center to lead this working group. Greg, what were some of the major infrastructure challenges that your working group encountered as you try to move from Western Europe, or specifically Germany, into the Western Balkans?
Okay, thank you, Ben. And I apologize if you hear some construction noise behind me. I think they're out there working on military mobility. Yeah, so our challenge was how do we get into this region, primarily of Kosovo, several different spots there, multinational battle group headquarters or the K4 headquarters. And the approaches generally were, we looked at were from seaports along the Adriatic or down from the Greek port of Thessaloniki, or potentially then going from those ports and then transiting on roads and rails as possible. We also considered, an overland route, which was used in 1995 to get to the region that the I-4 forces, the US-led forces, went in the 1995 operation, as well as thought a little bit about the potential issues with using waterways to get there in the rivers. Generally, we found in some cases, for example, looking at the port of Bar, that our commercial partners, thankfully, we had GDELs and Oshkosh on our team, were very helpful in being able to go back and find out what the commercial industry has been able to do, the type of things they've been able to move lately. And it found that, for example, Bar has a lot of limitations in unloading and staging large equipments, and the roads going out of there is not as well used as in other cases. Whereas, for example, Dures, the port of Dures does have a lot of capacity, and they've moved a lot of heavy and large equipment through that region in recent times. On top of that, that is often the primary route that the current forces use to get, the military forces that use to get up to the K4 location. So they practice and work along that line. But then other parts of infrastructure, saying the Greek port, that has a lot of capacity, but then that adds sort of a different thing, where you've got a place where there is Russian and Chinese ownership and influence on aspects of that port which can make a difference depending on the particular scenario or contingency operation. So certain times you may have the access and the ability, but you can't really use it. Last comment, then I'll just maybe touch a little bit on cyber and the cyber challenge and communication infrastructure. You know, we need to assume in all these that there's going to be cyber disruptions that could attack the infrastructure. It could be, say, undersea cables where you have old ones in the Adriatic Sea, which are vulnerable. And, you know, I don't know who's really assessed the cable landing stations. And then when you get to the terrestrial level, that's all along rights of ways next to roads, easy to be degraded and interfered with. And then finally, any sort of attacks that could become on a broadband level. And you can think of this, for example, say just a ship trying to get to the port, somebody hacks into the manifest, destroys critical data, and really disrupts the operation. So the goals here could be just to slow the movement and sow chaos, or to try and shut it down altogether. So as you can see, across the board, whether it's physical or in the cyber world, there are many challenges. Over to you.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, and I love the sound of construction in the background. That's your tax dollars at work there. So you mentioned the seaport in Greece. I think Thessaloniki is the one that is controlled predominantly by a Greek-Russian oligarch, and of course Piraeus is almost 100% controlled by Chinese interests, which is why the U.S. Army in Europe has begun looking at Alexandroupoli. And in fact, they've done work there along with U.S. private investment to make Alexandroupoli a port of entry for U.S. and NATO forces into the region. What did you discover in terms of capacity of these seaports? You talked a little bit about the ability to get from the seaport inland, but in terms of capacity, is there any of them that stood out as being the best or most useful?
Well, I think I think each one is a mixed bag of their capabilities. We definitely, like I mentioned earlier, BARD had some significant limitations, and Dures was much more favorable in what they had there. You know, both the ports in Greece are pretty substantial and have a lot of ability. And one of the things that's good about the Thessaloniki, sorry if I'm not saying it right, port in Greece, is that there are good rail lines there going directly up in the direction of Kosovo towards Pristina that could be used and don't have that many limitations on them. I mean, like anything else, there are places, bridges and restrictions and things like that along the way that will be of concern. But I also understand that the Alexandroupoli port is going to have some increasingly good railway lines heading up towards Bulgaria as well, which will give you some additional alternatives on how you might transport and get equipment there. Over to you.
Okay, thanks. Let me ask you one more question. This comes from our friend Steve Danner at Acro Bridge. The subject is declassification of information. I don't know if you encountered that much in your particular working group. NATO, EU difficulties with distributing and sharing information. First of all, did you encounter that as a major issue, and how do you work around that to do the cooperation with industry, but also with the different nations that may or may not be inside a NATO or EU classified network?
Yeah, that certainly came up. I guess first I should say that we had an outstanding group of representatives from NATO and EU, and they were very, very helpful in what they suggested. But there is this challenge of they're not all on the same page, and they don't necessarily have the network to communicate with. And you know, something like this really needs standards and a whole government approach where everybody's working together, and it's tough to do when you have to get all these nations to agree. And in this scenario, as you say, you got some countries are in NATO, some are in the EU, some are in both, some are in none, and some aspire to be in one or the other. So it's an interesting mix. We also came across, excuse me, the host nation support database. They call them capability catalogs that NATO maintains. So we're able to get some information about that, but most of that is kept at a classified level. And I think what the EU does is also there, but that has most of the information you need. But as our industry partners point out, there are good commercial databases that they have to operate with on a regular basis that could really enhance this effort. So how to actually pull all that together, I think, is a significant challenge. And, and I think there'll always be an issue with either some of the data being considered classified, or it could just be sensitive where a host nation really doesn't want it being out to the general public to have access to it. So I think that's a challenge that is one that could be solvable, but people are going to have to put their heads down and work on it over time. And ultimately, it will take that cooperation of senior political leaders to realize that they need to cooperate on something like this, or they'll never get to the objective.
Greg, thanks. One of our listeners just pointed out, he said the classified data belongs to nations and is not NATO's or the EU's to share. That's true in part, although there is a NATO classified network, for example, and the nations decide what they're going to put into the network. But the point is, how do we solve these problems, recognizing that we're working with a mix of civilian industry, military organizations, national organizations, and so on. Thanks again, Greg, for you guys took on a tough challenge. Let me go to Julian. Julian, and I want to emphasize briefly, please, key takeaways for you from the Western Balkans scenario in about a minute and a half, and then Heinrich, same thing for you, about a minute and a half.
Thanks, Ben. 3 issues for me. One was infrastructure capacity, ability to move force and resource at any speed into the region. Second was the growing influence of Chinese and Russian influence, not just over infrastructure, but also over governments in the region. And third was the issue that Greg raised, which was repeated throughout the scenarios, which is this issue of the sharing of information. I was interested a number of times that people said, on the one hand, we really need to do this, but on the other hand, we are prevented from sharing information because of certain, what I consider outmoded and outdated rules. We are going to have single points of contact to act as brokers for information and indeed planning. We are going to have to carry out detailed surveys by both military and civil actors of routes and threats. We are going to have to consider resiliency across the civil-military piece. And again, it emphasizes to me, Ben, that we have to adopt a holistic approach if military mobility is needed to a level that we aspire to, and that finally requires political leadership to break through these micro barriers that prevent a macro solution. Ben?
Thank you very much. Heinrich, let me ask you a specific question, if I may. It just came up from Chuck Berry, who was an active participant from the National Defense University back in Washington in the scenarios. And this goes back to the classification question. Chuck asked, would the NATO concept of federated mission networks help solve the information classification and operational command and control issues? Could you address that?
And I'm a retired general. I have been retired for 2 years, and this is a very specific question which requires specific expertise. For me, the problem of classified and non-classified information exchanges, it's even much broader. There is a difficulty or problem for both NATO and European Union to exchange classified information for reasons which we should not discuss. This has to do with the dispute between Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus. And it has to do with the existing regulations. And I'm not very optimistic that we can overcome this challenge very soon. But let me comment on the scenario as such a moment. For me, it has shown the relevance of improving military mobility, even for crisis response operations and for those regions. The Balkans is not only relevant to NATO, but also for the European Union. The European Union has 2 missions there, EUFOR and EULEX in Kosovo, EUFOR in Bosnia and EULEX in Kosovo, and NATO has KFOR deployed there. So it is an example why the European Union should have a genuine interest in improving infrastructure and in improving the regulations and the procedures, the arrangements required to quickly cross borders and transition through European nations to the Balkan region, which is of particular importance for both NATO and the European Union. Back to you.
Thank you. Let's turn now to our 4th scenario. This was the famous Suwałki corridor. And of course, we call it a corridor, not a gap, because a corridor is something that you want to keep open. This is what connects most of NATO to our 3 Baltic allies, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And with the challenging situation, the dangerous situation in Belarus, that makes the Suwałki corridor even more tenuous. And so Jacek Bartosiak and his working group took a look at how do we enhance mobility to enable forces to get there in time to prevent a crisis or to effectively respond to a crisis. Jacek, let me ask you specifically, what did your working group look at in terms of mission command for this region? You know, we've got multinational corps northeast, you've got different divisions, you've got U.S. forces in the area, you've got JFC Brunsum. What's the mission? What is the right mission command framework for this particular scenario?
Hi, Ben. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here. Of course, it's a brilliant question and a complex one, given the peculiarity of this scenario, which we think here on the NATO Eastern flank that this is the most critical in terms of the cohesion of the alliance and the security of Europe. And that is why it's also important for both NATO and European Union. And of course, NATO is the alliance with many allies, many countries, and this is also the Suwałki corridor is far away from the Atlantic coast, so theoretically and geographically far away from the main transportation hubs and the main entry points for the U.S. forces. This is why it's critically important to make sure politically and then militarily that in crisis, and our scenario was not about war fighting par excellence per se, but about reacting in crisis, because this is all about military mobility. And of course, we have faced obstacles. We have faced problems, choke points, not only in terms of geographic terrains and routes, but also regulations and also command and control aspects. Actually, who is in charge of certain aspects of movement if it's not an open war? What about the interaction between the civilian organizations, civilian, local, and national governments, and also the business organizations that control infrastructure? And this is, and also coordination between NATO and EU in terms of how you sort of control movement of weapons actually across the territory, if this is not a war. And still we need to react as the speed of reaction, speed of movement is of critical importance in terms of deterrence, stabilizing in this way the security architecture and undermining the Russian new generation warfare strategy. So it's of course we can't dive into details. Some of it is classified as exactly what is the chain of command and so on and so forth. But there is a sort of a risk that might be exploited by the enemy that CEPA, in terms of how you influence the force package and its movement, might be a sort of a play that will be played against our cohesion. So I would like to emphasize this aspect.
So Jacek, let me ask a question that comes from Ray Wojcik. You know, Ray, of course, spent so much time there in Poland as the U.S. Army attaché. It says, how can we innovate? And the question will be about exercises. And I loved it that General Kinsvater, by the way, the Deputy Chairman of the Military Committee, emphasized the importance of exercises to help drive all of this. So Ray's question, how can we innovate exercise scheduling and exercise scenarios that would drive military mobility solutions? As he describes it accurately, there are a dizzying array of hundreds of annual NATO, US, multilateral, and national exercises occurring across Europe. Is there a way we could get more synergy out of these? So exercises, how can we improve military mobility through exercising?
Oh, I think it boils down to understanding the infrastructure east of the Oder and the Elba River. And this infrastructure is completely, I mean, not completely, but different from what you can see in the Western Europe. And that has a heavy bearing on the speed of movement. And that has to be exercised back and forth all the time. Of course, there is one other thing. There is no one axis of advance of movement. We should have alternative reserve routes, multiple access and entry points, not only from Bremerhaven to Suwałki corridor, as is in this scenario. That's my personal opinion. We must have alternative entry point, including in Poland, in the south strategic depth area, in the Silesia, and so on and so forth. And it has to be tested and verified by many exercises. And I think that the message that we would send then to the enemy would be that if the enemy planners would see that we control the strategic flows and we can really sustain the dynamics, the momentum, and the intensity of strategic flows, meaning movement of troops as we wish them, in timelines as we wish, and in force packages as we wish, I think it would be a highly deterrent effect. That's why it's critically important to show that we are the masters of strategic flows in terms how we exercise and move the troops, actually all across the NATO eastern flank, in Romania as well, and elsewhere in our scenarios. I think this would be the most important factor in this environment. That's an important difference between the Cold War and the current situation. That's previous situation was more fixed. Troops were amassing, against each other on Central Front, while here there is this geographical disadvantage on the NATO part and asymmetry. That's why speed of movement and reaction as a deterrence is much more important, and the forces are smaller now, which means that we really need to move, and movement is of critical importance so that there are no gray zones events that undermine our cohesion. That's why as many exercises in different places, infrastructure showing that we understand the infrastructure, because the Russians know the infrastructure in this part of Europe very well, and they will see whether we have excellency in understanding how that works. Not to mention the real war fighting, that the cyber activity, things that they would try to undermine or act against, and so on.
Jacek, what a great description. And one of our listeners, Josh Arnold Forster, makes another good suggestion about serving government ministers involved in some of these exercises so that they can appreciate the time, space factors, what's required to be able to move from A to be, and also you've reminded me how much we depend on host nation support, that the vast majority of transportation, for example, is not going to be done on green trucks. It's going to be on commercial transport, and of course, Deutsche Bahn cargo and other rail networks. I'm going to turn to Dr. Phil Peterson for the fifth scenario, which was focused on Romania and specifically the famous Focșani Gate. This scenario took a look at the very challenging terrain, the obstacle presented by the Carpathian Mountains, and then the Danube River. Is it an obstacle, or is it something that helps for this particular scenario? Phil, talk to me about the infrastructure. What did your working group describe or find when you took a look at Focșani Gate? And let me preface this with a statement that came out yesterday at the 3Cs Summit, the 3Cs Initiative Summit, where Romanian President Klaus Iohannis said that Romania's main objective is finalizing the strategic interconnection projects. The European Commission has repeatedly criticized Romania's limited capacity to connect with its neighbors. So what did y'all see as far as what needs to be done in Romania to improve infrastructure necessary for improving military mobility?
Thank you. Well, actually, Romania needs to invest in its infrastructure, which is actually not happening. And the 3Cs initiative can play a very useful coordinating role in making sure that it's a rational investment that results in the connectivity that's necessary. What I see as a unique role for Romania is the nurturing of a mature political culture in Serbia. That's getting the Serbs to think of themselves as Europeans instead of little brothers to the Russians.
So that's interesting that you mentioned Serbia, because I know both Hungary and Romania have talked about the importance of stability in Serbia as kind of the back door into the Black Sea region. And of course, I think this is related to the Danube River. How did your group see the Danube as an artery for mobility or as an obstacle?
Well, actually, the group saw it both as an opportunity as well as an obstacle. You know, the thing is, the West is so enamored with rail and aviation transportation today that we forget the least expensive way to move bulk product is by water. And the Danube River offers tremendous opportunity in that regard. And I might say that actually, you know, when we think about the Focșani Gate, it's actually great tank country. The problem is you have to cross a lot of river barriers to get onto, and I might add off of, that battlefield. So solving the rail and road challenges of getting to the battlefield is a long-term investment challenge because very little has been done in this regard. Over to you, Ben.
Jill, I think we might have just lost Ben here for a second. So I was wondering if maybe we could go back to Julian and Heinrich just to comment on a little bit of what Phil has just raised. Julian, do you want to take that first?
Yes, thank you. It's fascinating, and thank you for Phil for leading a complex scenario. The challenge for me for that whole scenario was, why would the enemy even consider moving into there, given how difficult we find it to move in as well? It would take a very large Russian army, much larger than exists today, to actually get in, stay, pacify, and then what? Because the simple truth is, it's a very hard area to get in and out of. So in terms of the military mobility challenge, what struck me as being indicative from this scenario was the need for early indicators. That if one is to have a hypothetical crisis short of a war in that scenario, you need very early indicators, very early movement over a raft of different multimodal transport systems. And here the Danube is relevant because it's not yet a conflict, it's short of war, and movements can take place. In fact, I would say, looking at the scenario from a mobility viewpoint, the Danube was clearly extremely important given how hard it was to move into that area in any other way. So for my mind, whilst the scenario itself was perhaps the least likely to take place, it did, by its very complexity, highlight the overarching challenges that our forces and resources would face in any crisis in Southeast Europe, should one arise. Lauren?
Thanks, Julian. That's a really good point. And I think something that did come up in the scenario discussions, which I had the pleasure to listen into a few times. Heinrich, over to you for any reactions to what both Phil and Julian have raised thus far.
I must say that Lauren, that I agree with Julian. The Black Sea region from a NATO point of view, not necessarily from a United States point of view, is certainly one of the regions at risk if it comes to a crisis and conflict with Russia. If Russia, for example, planned or decided to conduct a large-scale operation, then a number of regions would be at risk and could be subject of such an attack. From northern Norway, the Baltic Sea region, in particular the Baltic region, the Black Sea region with Romania, and even eastern part of Turkey. So that is out of question, that is admitted. But NATO's clear center of gravity is the Baltic region. Why? Because the Baltic states and Poland share common borders with Russia. The Russian center of gravity is placed there. So with a view to that region, this is of high importance and so urgent. Why we need to accelerate the implementation of military mobility, why we need to overcome all the impediments, why we need to coordinate and harmonize, not to say make identical, the procedures for cross-border permission, for transition to the nations between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And why we need to convince the European Union to spend much more on improving infrastructure as they are about to decide. And that is, for me, important because also Romania and the Black Sea region would benefit from a clear effort by the European Union member states, by the European Union organization, and by NATO allies to do everything and to make every effort to accelerate military movement and to tackle and overcome all the difficulties we still face to implement military movement across Europe.
Super. And I think Ben is back on with us. So Ben, do you want to pick up where we left off? We were just having Julian and Heinrich react to some of what Phil presented.
Hey, Lauren, thank you. I'm here in beautiful Beaufort, South Carolina, one of the most beautiful parts of America. Unfortunately, the telecom industry has not quite reached this part of the coast. So anyway, okay, I think that we probably are close to the time anyhow, where we'll want to hand over and listen to Admiral Bauer. But let me ask Julian, for what are your, Julian, after you listen to this, and of course, you know, you're going to write, you've got the pen for us to write the final report. What are kind of one or two main things that you think are just essential that have got to get done and that you'll want to convey in the written report? And then Heinrich, I'll ask you the same question.
Three issues. First, what to me is the metaphor for military mobility, the ability to move dangerous goods across borders in a crisis short of a conflict. If we can get the nations and the institutions singing from the same hymn sheet on that, then we have taken a great step forward towards military mobility as a deterrent and not just an action. Second is the vital importance of exercising and training. I saw one of our colleagues mention that ministers should take place. I can recall that ministers used to take part in UK exercises. And it was quite sobering watching a minister with responsibility, like Prime Minister, for a nuclear strike being put in a position where they play themselves in that role. I think there has been a disconnect with the political class because they do not take place in exercising and training. But I would say, having been the head of SIG for the ARC, that all exercising and training, particularly exercising, should take place as part of a development program, a design development program that at the end of it achieves a series of outcomes of which military mobility is one, to enhance deterrence given the nature of the threat that we face. Exercises must be a development program, in which case they must fail at times. We must be willing to let exercises fail to learn the necessary lessons. And that's going to take, again, another mindset change. And I thought Jacek's point about strategic flows was critical. Strategic flows on our territories. If we cannot control strategic flows on our territory, then deterrence and defense is failing. And by the nature of flow, military mobility is central to that. So to conclude, what the report must, to my mind, point out, given the audience we're seeking to address, an audience of politicians, of policymakers, of people of influence who need to make this call, given many calls on the limited resources that they have before them. Military mobility must be sold as a solution for them, not another problem, not another idea, but an efficient solution which can help them close the ends, ways, and means gap which the COVID-19 economic crisis will throw up. If we can present military mobility, which I believe, as an essential part of Europe's strategic solution in a challenging economic and military environment, then we will succeed. If we don't, we fail. Ben?
Julian, thank you. Before I turn to Heinrich, let me highlight the fact that we were very fortunate to have not only partners from industry who provided expertise, but we also had cooperation from numerous agencies and organizations from throughout the European Union and across NATO at multiple levels. And this was on top of their day job. So I'm extremely grateful to the MCCE, for example, and to the SJLSG and the JSEC and and Multinational Corps Northeast, JFC Brunsum. And I've got I'm just going to read the note that just came in from General Kai Brinkman, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff Plans at Multinational Corps Northeast. I think it's worth everybody hearing what Kai has offered, and then Heinrich, I'll come to you for final comment. This is from General Brinkman. Having listened intently to the interesting discussion about the scenarios, I wonder if the following 4 aspects would find common agreement. Number 1, we require more detailed advanced planning and dedicated headquarters with regional expertise to do this. And I like the idea of regional headquarters that focus, which is different from the current approach where the JFCs alternate. And I think there's a lot of merit in regional constant unblinking eye attention. Number 2, without realistic exercises, we will not be able to define the necessities or the requirements. These have to be conducted with a solid command and control and improved coordination among different actors. Again, I think that this theme of exercises that are realistic and not just the DV day, but the actual hard work involving movement that General Kensvater mentioned. Number 3, holistic and close civil-military cooperation is essential. And I completely agree with that. As I mentioned earlier, most of the mobility is not going to happen on green army trucks. It's going to happen on commercial, and because we are operating inside the sovereign territory of allied nations. And so we're going to have to work with local authorities. Many of those nations will require some sort of police or military escort. And most roads in small villages are not accustomed to 75-ton tanks churning up the cobblestones. And then finally, from Kai, coming from the ground level, he considers himself at the ground level. He was pleased that the workshop has addressed top-down strategic as well as bottom-up issues in enhancing military mobility as part of collective defense and crisis response. Heinrich.
As you, then I subscribe to everything what Kai Brinkman has proposed, wholeheartedly support that. And please forgive me that I, in a staccato wise, mentioned a couple of things which I think should also be reflected in our report. And one is also an idea from the multinational headquarters Northeast, coordinated with the Joint Support Enabling Command, that the nations should establish national territorial commands, at least the transit nations, to provide the full-fledged host nation support for those forces who are transitioning and moving through their country in various aspects to make sure that the forces arrive and can arrive where they are needed, and provide rear area security, military movement control, waterway crossing, damage repair, telecom links, supply and medical support. I think this is something which we need to keep in mind. In addition, the whole discussions and all the working group discussions have shown that how important it is that the timelines for granting cross-border movement and transit permission between NATO and the EU are being harmonized and identical. In NATO, we have 3 days In the European Union, there are 5 days, and 5 days means in reality a week. They need to be identical. Speed is of the essence. Custom procedures and forms must be standardized, simplified, and digitized. Every custom officer at every border crossing must be aware of, trained, and able to correctly apply those procedures. Third, the legal basis for military transport and dangerous goods by nations should be harmonized, in particular between those who are where military movement or military forces need to transition. Fourth, the NATO should complete, and they are working on that, the establishment of their 24/7 movement control network. In other words, the network of single national points of contact for military movement should be set up both in NATO and the EU, and they should be harmonized. Point of contacts reach out to all the civilian and military authorities in each nation. 4 or 5, the European Commission Fund for improving infrastructure, co-financing infrastructure need to be raised. 1.5 is way too little. The original figure of 6.5 billion for improving that infrastructure should be a guideline. 6, the applications for co-financing projects taken from the NATO's military network, those infrastructure projects along the main supply routes should be launched, and military expertise from NATO and the European Union should be included in the assessment and decision process, in the selection process. And finally, and some at NATO will hate me for that, NATO should consider common funding for improving infrastructure along its own main supply routes. That is crucial to enabling rapid movement and sustainment for military forces in theater, as they are not just for nations, but for the benefit of NATO as a whole. And I can only underline and emphasize the importance of all of this need to be tested and exercised regularly, both within NATO, the European Union, and between the both. And we should use almost every opportunity to exercise this procedure. Back to you, Ben.
Heinrich, thank you. You and Julian both keeping this focused on the major strategic issues, and to all 5 working group leaders able to convey critical technical, tactical, and operational level points that came out of these virtual workshops. Thanks very much for that. There's still a few questions coming in, but we are out of time, and I just regret that we're not going to be able to touch on them. But one that Chuck Berry asked, can we build a database of infrastructure improvements that also improve commerce at the national level? Dual use improvements. I would hardly endorse that. And then Tanya Letici, she's equal to a Armored Brigade combat team herself, just with her brain and energy, talked about in a crisis that would entail troop deployment under either EU or NATO flag. How do we blend these things? I mean, what makes it automatically EU or automatically NATO? And I think in reality, since most of the countries involved are the same, there will be a lot of blending probably, but our political leaders and strategic planners will have to think through the authorities and who does what. But we'll leave it to Julian and to solve that in the final written report. For all of you, our written report will be published in January of 2021. It'll be available publicly. More information to follow on that. And I would encourage listeners, but also the members of the working groups, to continue to provide information to your working group leaders, who will then feed that into Karsten Schmiedel, who then provides it for Julian and Heinrich to complete our written report. So our conclusion is a brief message from Admiral Rob Bauer. What a gigantic contribution by the Netherlands to provide such an outstanding officer as Rob Bauer. He gets it. He's a great strategic thinker, but he's also a doer. And I love his practical, common sense, yet strategic approach to doing things, which is probably why he's been elected to be the next chairman of the military committee to begin duties next summer. Currently serving as the Chief of Defense of the Netherlands, a great Royal Netherlands naval officer. And we asked him to do this also because the Netherlands is the lead nation for PESCO. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karsten, who will bring up Admiral Bauer, and that will conclude our military mobility outbrief today. So Karsten, let's hear from the Admiral.